Right, moving right along, we're just breaking these videos up to make them a little bit shorter for folks. The last one was kind of long, but we are roughly on page 42 now, and this is, if you like, section 2.2 in the way that I'm breaking it up. But we've been talking about all of these examples from historical philosophers, examples of antithesis, that it is Christ versus everything else. And the differences between the different kinds of everything else really are of secondary, tertiary, or really no importance. Um, because by definition, what they're doing is they are deviating from the truth in Christ. And so the deep structure of all of them is going to be similar to each other and opposed to Christianity. And that the upshot of that later on is that you don't need to defeat every single alternative to Christianity serially. Right? You'll have these atheists who say, well, what about Zeus? What about Odin? Right? I'm just one more God atheistic than you are. You don't believe in any of them. I just don't believe in one more God than you don't believe in. And that's just a very silly argument. That's sort of where Ventil is going with this. And he adds a few, from our perspective, even more obscure theologians and philosophers to the list of thinkers that he's talking about. And they are important in these pages only insofar as they are contemporary to Van Til at the time. And what they're doing is they are bringing into America and popularizing 20th century philosophy, particularly Heidegger, in American universities like New School, and also some liberal seminaries. And that's why I have said that this volume really is the most openly philosophical of all of Van Til's volumes, even though it's a little bit more obscure. That they are all, the argument that they are all the same is shown by the quotations that he picks up that show their similarities, and their basic contours far outweigh any distinctions that they have one from each other. And so he starts to talk in this section about Jonas, who was a philosopher and a college professor at New School, and how Jonas interprets Gnosticism, which is what he's been talking about in this chapter. And Jonas is going to contrast Gnosticism with older Greek thought. So that would be the pre-Socratics and possibly the Stoics. And this is what we get, that according to the Greeks, quote, the universe was considered to be the perfect exemplar of order. Stoic monism led to a complete identification of the cosmic and the divine, of the universe and God. Cicero, in the second book of The Nature of the Gods, gives eloquent expression to the theological status of the visible universe. Therefore, the veneration of the cosmos is the veneration of the whole, of which man himself is a part. And of course, the Gnostics don't like that is determinism. They want to be radically free. So Jonas resumes here. True God is the unknown, the totally other, unknowable in terms of any worldly analogies. We could think of the famous elephant illustration, where you have a bunch of blind men approaching an elephant, and they feel along to figure out what kind of thing it is. And one over by the trunk says, I feel a vine. And one over by the side of the elephant says, no, I feel a wall. And one over by the leg says, no, I feel a tree trunk, right? And the idea is none of them has a complete picture, and all of them are mistaken. They are actually aspects of the one elephant that is the uniting reality behind all of those three lesser mistaken realities. But the problem is that assumes that you are in the position to see an elephant, that you are not blind, and you have the higher view from nowhere to make that assessment. And that's just not the case. So, resuming our Jonas quote here. He's unknowable in terms of any worldly analogy. The world is the creation not of God, but of some inferior principle whose inferiority is a perversion of the divine. Man's inner self is not part of the world, of the demiurge's creation and domain, but is within that world as totally transcendent and as incommensurate to all cosmic modes of being. That is the all-important difference. For the Stoics, all is one. Matter including the soul, and you are part of it. For the Gnostics, matter is evil. For the Stoics, matter is all there is. For the Gnostics, matter is half of what there is, and matter is evil. And your oneness is in the ineffable, noumenal, non-material realm, not in matter. Jonas says that this is progress. This is getting closer to Christianity. Cornelius Van Til looks at that and he says, but you're still all pantheists. You're still all saying that you are basically God, or the same with God, or that God is in everything. All you've done in moving from Stoicism to Gnosticism is you've relocated the mystery. I'm not one with the universe now, I'm one with the ineffable beyond the universe. Doesn't that sound so modern at the same time, right? Think of literature and our great archetypes of stories that we tell each other, right? Every story falls into one of like 3 or 4 stories. We've never invented a new one, right? The story about finding my place in the world, being my authentic self. Or you look at, downstream of that, all of the sexual and gender revolution, right? It's the same sort of self-definition as we see in the Garden of Eden. It's, did God really say? You can choose for yourself. You can be your own interpreter. Van Til comes in and he says, we didn't make any progress moving from Plato to Zeno to Valentinus. All of them are antithetical of Christianity, where we believe in the self-existent God who created the material world and called it good, and that evil is the result not of some equal thing or principle over against God, not of a gradation of being, but of sin, but of an ethical perversion of goodness, which is defeated and done away with in real redemptive historical events, the life of Christ, bringing creation to its telos, its perfection, its completion, its end in an eternal new heavens and new earth. There's no room in that scheme for choose your own adventure. And the apologetic import of that is you're not going to persuade anyone of this biblical worldview, this biblical scheme, as one particular or even the best possible path on the choose your own adventure playbook. You've got to throw out the entire book. The Greeks are saying with one voice that man, as thinking man, participates in abstract deity. That our collective thinking just is the same thing as God thinking. That God does not speak authoritatively ad extra, except insofar as we ourselves speculate and do philosophy. But if being one with everything seems not quite right, if we're honest, if it seems to make us, preclude all change and difference, which seem to have some sort of reality and makes us very uncomfortable, well, then I have no choice, no freedom. And that's the one conclusion that we must not ever draw. So what do? Well, option number 1 is we flee in the direction of chaos and old night. Everything is random chance and contingency. And the end result of that path is existentialism and nihilism. Right? That's just the pure opposite. Everything is unrelated again, and you lose the whole system. Or, as in the case of Gnosticism, you move away from both poles at the same time. Neither pure logic nor pure chance, but rather what? Pure, unknowable, undefined other. Which Van Til says is suicide in 2 directions simultaneously. Yeah, it's a third thing, but it's not the correct third thing, because it's still on a foundation of me thinking it out through my fallen rebellion without reference to the living, speaking God. Do you see the crucial distinction there? And yes, these chapters are dense, but they are so central to Van Til's scheme of things, that if logic and rationalism are ultimate, then the end result is everything, including myself, is lost in abstract unity of being with no detail and no content, which just is Aristotle's God. If, on the other hand, irrational chance is ultimate, then there is no such thing as a system, and our freedom dissolves into meaningless nonsense. In either case, if you set out to be your own God, to take the place of God, if your immovable, non-negotiable square one is there is no God who created me and has the prerogative to teach me how to think. And by the way, you're not as open to persuasion about that question as you protest that you are, O unbeliever. If that is your starting point, you can never do anything but oscillate between these two poles of rationalism and irrationalism. And that is really what the whole entire history of Western and Eastern thought demonstrates to us. And that is exactly what Orthodox biblical Christianity alone is in real contrast with. That's the point that Van Til is trying to make by building up these examples. He turns to Irenaeus, and we'll cover him really quickly. His criticism of Irenaeus is the same as his criticism of the Arminians, that he allows too much natural ability to obey fallen man to obey God naturally in his fallen state. That we retain the free will to defy God's providential decree and to operate outside of or alongside it. That sin is not primarily ethical, but it's at least a little bit metaphysical. It has to do with our finiteness. That's not the Bible, that's Plato. Just to the extent that we are not dependent on God, that we are autonomous, to that same extent we cannot really fall, and we don't really need a savior. Those are fundamentally different worldviews, whether it calls itself Christian or not. That we can save ourselves under that system, having absorbed these Greek ideas, we can save ourselves by making better free choices. Even if it is the 1% choice to choose Christ or to cooperate with grace. Irenaeus didn't use those terms, but he's just showing you the through line from Irenaeus and this absorption of a little bit of Greek philosophy through to Arminianism and Roman Catholicism. For Irenaeus, salvation is deification, at least in part, at least a little bit, at least sometimes. It is Eastern Orthodox theology. There's some chain of being continuum, that being, non-being motif. He does not distance himself sufficiently from that. What about Tertullian? He still allows too much to the powers of unaided human reason. That God cannot be illogical according to man's concept of what is logical. He's not recognizing to a sufficient degree the noetic effects of sin on our concept of logic, that human logic after the fall is impaired, that it doesn't operate rightly. Yes, right reason can do X, Y, and Z, but we do not possess right reason apart from Christ. And you see, that's the problem. Anyone who says that we worship the same God as these not explicitly biblical philosophers is by definition importing all sorts of anti-Christian, incompatible assumptions into that definition of God, which will be disastrous to your whole system of theology. And they all end up in the same place every single time, because they start with the same rationalistic method. That we arrive at our God concept by iterative abstraction up to pure being. There's I don't know how well known it is, but there's a factoid out there that on Wikipedia, you know how the very first link, if you click the first link in any article, you will always end up back at ontology, the article for being, right? It'll always take you there. And then occasionally it'll loop you around back and forth. But you will always end up back at the Wikipedia page for being. And so that's essentially what we're doing with all of this thought. We think of things and we get to our concept of God by way of negation up the chain of being. So my dog has left us. He was sleeping over there before, but let's say we start with my dog. Well, he is specifically my dog. Well, what if I wanted to get more general than that? I might say, well, it's not my dog, but he's also a corgi, right? That's what unites him to all the other corgis. Well, I could say, yeah, but let's take that away and say now he's just a dog. Now I've included all of the Great Danes and all of the Pomeranians as well. Great, we could go further up and say, by subtracting more and more specificity, right? Take away some of his dogginess. Now he's an animal, and now we're in the box of all life, all living things, and then above that, everything that is real. So we're excluding the imaginary now, and then we get rid of that, and eventually we get back to being, pure being. Or we can proceed in the opposite direction and we can add more and more detail until we get all the way down to the other end of pure atomistic particularity, right? The difference is I think versus God said. What is your fundamental method for thinking about these things? What is your foundation? What is your ultimate authority? We think logically in analog to God's internal coherence that he has within himself. But we as Christians, we deny to human logic the power of the Judicium Contradictionis. Your logic doesn't get to decide, legislate what is and isn't possible. God does. And so in doing that, we would agree with Turretin and we would disagree with someone like Charles Hodge on that point. Because you see, for Van Til, your method and your conclusion are involved with one another. Inevitably. Always. It's just part of the deal. So if you are going to absorb autonomous philosophical methods, don't be surprised when the conclusion that you arrive at is the non-Christian God. Because it was bent that way all along. Rather, existence involves essence. You can't speak about God existing without knowing what God you're talking about. Yes, God exists. We agree that God exists, but it's not your God. It's my abstract one. And if you start with the methods, the dog is back. He's joined us. Hey, buddy. Good boy. If you start with the method of autonomy, you will always end up with the conclusion of autonomy without fail. So you cannot incorporate that and try to get to Christian conclusions. And for all of these early apologists, right, you're okay as far as it goes, but our philosophy is better. That's what they're saying. Aristotle, you had access to some truth. Let me just show you how to take that a couple steps further. They did not say, our philosophy is fundamentally opposed to yours at every point. And so the result is they could not avoid being inconsistent with their own theology at various points. Right? The Greek philosopher says we must avoid determinism at all costs. Well, Christians, we freely confess that the Bible teaches theological determinism as well as definite human responsibility. And we accept that both are somehow compatible on the authority of God's word. It's compatibilism. That is a live view that works. Calvinism is not inconsistent with freedom in the sense that Calvinists mean it. But anyway, that's aside. Go read Greg Welty and Anderson. They're a good expression of that. But I lost my place, excuse me. We believe that both are somehow true in a non-contradictory way because the Bible tells us that both things are true. And the only way that you escape that is by appealing to your own higher authority and setting it up over against the Christian position. So you see what Van Til has done. He's assessed Greek thought. He said there is a through line from Greek thought all the way through to modern thinking. They are eerily similar. Why? Because their foundation is the same. human autonomy. And these early apologists did not recognize that, and so they unthinkingly, uncritically absorbed a method that led to a deficient and ineffective apologetic that has plagued the church down to this day. And we can do better if we are just consistent about our theology all the way through. And that is what he will eventually get to. But he's showing us piece by piece how this can be demonstrated over and over again from these real historical philosophical examples. And that is just so valuable. You don't find it too many other places in this level of detail in Van Til's corpus.